Chapter 2. The Harbour Keeps Its Promise. Walter Bramble awoke to the sound of gulls holding what could only be described as a committee meeting. Not an organised committee, the sort that began with good intentions before dissolving into interruptions, accusations, and somebody shouting simply because everyone else was. Walter lay still for a moment beneath the unfamiliar quilt. The room smelled faintly of salt, old timber, and lavender polish. Beyond the bedroom window came the rhythmic sigh of the tide as it crept gently against the harbour wall. He looked at the alarm clock. 6:23. He frowned. At home, he would never have considered getting out of bed before 7 unless there was a pressing reason, such as a leaking roof or an irresistible bacon sandwich. Here, however, the village already sounded awake. He pulled back the curtains. The harbour below had been transformed. Yesterday afternoon it had been busy. This morning it was purposeful. Small fishing boats edged quietly towards the harbour mouth. Men in waterproof jackets untied ropes with practiced movements. A woman in bright yellow Wellingtons wheeled crates towards the quay, while someone further along shouted cheerfully that they had forgotten the bait again. Walter smiled. He had always enjoyed watching people who knew exactly what they were doing. It was one of the reasons he liked libraries. Everyone seemed quietly occupied with something sensible. He dressed, descended the narrow staircase, and put the kettle on. Only after the water had begun boiling did he discover Rose Cottage contained neither tea bags nor milk. There was coffee. Walter regarded the jar suspiciously. Instant coffee always seemed to promise much more than it delivered. Still, needs must. He stirred a spoonful into a mug and took one cautious sip. It tasted faintly of disappointment. By 7:30, he was walking towards the harbour bakery. He had not noticed it yesterday. This was largely because yesterday he had been concentrating on finding Rose Cottage without breaking an ankle on Margaret's famous loose step. The bakery announced itself long before Walter reached it. Fresh bread possesses one of civilization's greatest advertising campaigns. Warm air drifted into the street, carrying the smell of crusty loaves, butter, and cinnamon buns. Walter entered. Behind the counter stood a cheerful woman with flour in her hair. "You'll be Mr. Bramble." Walter stopped walking. He looked around the empty shop. "Does everyone know?" She laughed. "Oh, yes." "How?" She shrugged. "We're a small village. I've been here less than 24 hours. Plenty of time." Walter accepted defeat. "I'm Alice." "Walter." "I know." She handed him a paper bag before he had ordered anything. "You'll want the breakfast loaf." "I will." "You do now." Walter looked inside. Still warm. A generous wedge of farmhouse bread, 2 butter curls, homemade strawberry jam. "I hadn't actually decided." "You've just decided." Walter realized arguing would almost certainly result in less bread. He paid happily. Alice leaned on the counter. "Seen the Evelyn May yet?" Walter looked up. "I have." "You've been asking questions." "So I've gathered." She smiled. "Curiosity suits you." "It rarely helps." "No." She nodded towards the harbour. "But sometimes it does." Before Walter could ask another question, a customer entered carrying 3 crabs in a bucket. The conversation was clearly over. Walter carried his breakfast to a bench overlooking the harbour. Morning sunshine had finally broken through the clouds, painting the water silver. He had almost finished the second slice when someone sat beside him. "Mind if I join you?" Walter recognized the voice. It belonged to Elias Rowe. The retired harbour master held a mug nearly as battered as its owner. They sat quietly for several minutes. Walter had long believed silence between strangers was underrated. Eventually, Elias spoke. "You watched the boat again last night?" Walter looked sideways. You saw me? I saw someone. I thought there was somebody aboard. There wasn't. I also heard music. Elias smiled very faintly. The sea borrows sounds. I've never heard it borrow a tune before. No, Walter waited. Nothing more came. You enjoy answering half a question. I've had practice. After breakfast, Walter wandered along the quay. Several fishermen were repairing lobster pots. It looked surprisingly complicated. One of them looked up. You any good with rope? Walter answered honestly. Historically, no. Perfect. Before he fully understood what had happened, Walter found himself sitting on an upturned bucket, attempting to weave bright blue cord through a damaged lobster pot. The fisherman introduced himself as Ben. Ben demonstrated once. It appeared simple. Walter attempted the same movement. Within 30 seconds, the rope had wrapped itself around his wrist, the pot, and, somehow, one boot. Ben examined the result. I've never actually seen anyone tie a lobster pot to themselves. I was experimenting. It certainly looks experimental. Another fisherman wandered over. He looked down. What's he making? No idea, Ben replied. It isn't a lobster pot. Walter spent the next hour being gently educated by 3 fishermen who possessed endless patience and a worrying tendency to laugh whenever he became entangled. By the end, he had produced something vaguely resembling a repaired pot. It'll do, Ben said kindly. It won't. No. But the lobsters won't complain. I suspect they might. They've never written in. Just before lunchtime, Margaret found Walter. There you are. I was helping. I heard. I repaired fishing equipment. You certainly interacted with it. She handed him a folded tea towel. I need a favor. I'm beginning to suspect holidays involve rather a lot of work. You'll survive. She pointed towards the harbour office. I need someone to take sandwiches to Elias. Walter accepted the basket. Why can't he fetch them himself? He says he's busy. Doing what? Being retired. The harbour office was a small stone building overlooking the moorings. Walter knocked. Come in. Maps covered the walls. Old tide tables filled shelves. Brass instruments gleamed from polished cabinets. Elias sat beside the window studying a weather chart. Lunch, Walter announced. Margaret sent you. Apparently retirement is exhausting, Elias chuckled. She's right. Walter unpacked the sandwiches, cheese and pickle, ham, fruitcake, a flask of tea. Margaret clearly believed in generous lunches. Elias nodded towards a framed photograph hanging beside the desk. Walter stepped closer. The picture showed Gull's haven almost 50 years earlier. Children stood barefoot on the quay. Fishing boats crowded the harbour. In the centre floated a familiar vessel, the Evelyn May. Only she looked different, freshly painted, her deck crowded with smiling people. A young man stood at the wheel. Beside him a woman laughed into the wind. Walter studied the photograph. They look happy. They were. The owner? Yes. What was his name? Elias hesitated. Thomas Harcourt. And the lady? There was another pause. Evelyn. Walter looked again at the gold letters painted along the boat's bow. The Evelyn May. It was named after her. Yes. What happened? Elias folded the weather chart. The sandwiches are excellent. Walter sighed. You've changed the subject. I have. You do that professionally. I used to. Walter laughed. I suspect I'd have found you infuriating 40 years ago. You'd have been right. That afternoon the harbour grew busier. Visitors arrived, children bought ice creams, artists unpacked easels. Someone began playing an accordion outside the pub. Walter bought a newspaper he never opened. Instead, he wandered slowly along the waterfront. He found himself standing beside the Evelyn May once again. In daylight, she seemed even more carefully maintained. The varnish gleamed. The ropes looked almost new. Fresh flowers stood in a tiny brass holder beside the cabin window. Walter frowned. Fresh flowers. Someone had placed them there that morning. He was certain of it. A little girl skipped past, holding her father's hand. She stopped beside the boat. "Morning," she said cheerfully. Then they continued walking. Walter watched them disappear. He turned as Alice emerged from the bakery carrying another basket. "She talks to the boat every day." Alice smiled. "Lots of people do." "Why?" "Feels polite." Walter looked at her. "To a boat?" Alice shrugged. "You'll understand eventually." Late that evening, Walter sat outside the Anchor and Crown with Ben, Ned, and Tom. Stories drifted as easily as the tide. Ben described the time he'd accidentally caught a policeman's bicycle in a crab pot. Tom admitted he'd once painted his own front door the wrong colour because he'd forgotten which tin he'd opened. Even Ned confessed that Malcolm the seagull had stolen an entire pork pie from his pocket. Walter laughed harder than he had in months. As darkness settled over Gull's Haven, lamps reflected in the still water. The village grew quieter. One by one the conversations faded. Walter found himself looking once more towards the Evelyn May. She rested exactly where she'd been yesterday, unmoving, patient, waiting. Then Ben quietly said, without taking his eyes from the harbour, "Funny thing is..." Walter turned. Ben continued softly, "We all know she ought to have left years ago." A long silence followed. "But none of us could ever bring ourselves to untie that rope." Walter didn't ask why. Not this time. For the first time since arriving in Gull's Haven, he realized the villagers weren't hiding a mystery. They were protecting a memory. And somehow, he had the distinct feeling that the Evelyn May was beginning to trust him enough to tell it. Chapter 3. When the boat finally moved, Walter Bramble was beginning to understand that Gull's Haven possessed two entirely different clocks. There was the ordinary clock, the one hanging above the bakery door, ticking away with sensible determination. Then there was the harbour clock. Nobody could see it, nobody wound it, yet everyone seemed to live by it. It measured tides instead of hours, weather instead of dates, and memories instead of years. Walter had only been in the village for 4 days, yet he found himself checking the harbour before breakfast, in much the same way he usually checked whether the kettle had boiled. The first thing he noticed that morning was Malcolm. The large seagull was sitting proudly on the bonnet of a delivery van, refusing to move, despite the driver's increasingly inventive attempts at persuasion. "You've got 5 seconds, shouted the driver. Malcolm blinked. "I mean it!" Malcolm scratched behind one wing. The driver sighed. "He knows I can't actually drive off." Walter arrived just in time to witness Margaret emerge from the cafe carrying what appeared to be a stale bread roll. "You spoil him," Walter observed. "I negotiate with him." Margaret tossed the bread onto the harbour wall. Malcolm immediately abandoned the van. "There," she said. "Diplomacy. I suspect you've rewarded bad behaviour." "Possibly. But everyone leaves happy." Walter considered this. It struck him as a surprisingly effective philosophy. After breakfast, Elias appeared outside Rose's cottage. He carried 2 mugs of tea and an expression suggesting conversation was finally overdue. "I thought we'd walk." Walter accepted the mug. "I was beginning to think I'd imagined you. I've been deciding. Whether to speak to me? Whether you were ready." Walter smiled. "I'm 60-odd years old." "I know. But some people never become ready." They walked slowly along the harbour before climbing a narrow path above the village. From there, Gull's haven looked almost like a painting. Slate roofs tumbled towards the sea. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings, and beyond them, the Evelyn May, still exactly where she had always been. Elias rested both hands on the wooden fence overlooking the harbour. "I told you she belonged here." "You did. I wasn't avoiding your question. It rather sounded like you were." "I was answering a different one." Walter laughed quietly. "I've noticed." For several minutes neither man spoke. The breeze carried the smell of seaweed and wild thyme. Finally, Elias nodded towards the harbour. Thomas Harcourt built that boat with his father. Walter listened. It took them nearly 3 years. He fished from her every day. And Evelyn? They met when she came here on holiday. Walter smiled. A holiday. She stayed. Walter looked out towards the sea. They were happy. Elias's lined face softened. As happy as any two people I've ever known. The story emerged slowly. Not dramatically, not with theatrical pauses, simply as one old friend remembering another. Thomas and Evelyn had worked together every day. She kept the accounts. He caught the fish. In the evenings they would sit on the harbour wall eating sandwiches and watching the sunset, exactly as they had done since they were young. They never became wealthy. They never wanted to. The boat paid the bills. The village was home. Life was enough. Then Evelyn became ill. Very ill. During the final weeks she asked Thomas for only one promise. "Don't sell her." Walter looked at Elias. "The boat?" Elias nodded. "She said that boat had fed 3 generations of the family. It deserved better than being broken up or left to rot." So he promised. He did. Thomas kept fishing for another 8 years. Then, one autumn morning, he suffered a heart attack while repairing nets outside the harbour office. He never recovered. Walter looked down at the harbour below. "What happened then?" Elias smiled sadly. "Nobody could bear to break his promise." Walter frowned. "But Thomas had gone." "Yes. So who was the promise to?" "Evelyn." Walter said nothing. Elias continued. "Ben painted her. Tom repaired the engine. Alice polished the brass. Margaret always put flowers in the cabin. I checked the mooring ropes. The children learned never to climb aboard. The fishermen quietly replaced anything that wore out." Walter slowly looked back towards the Evelyn May. "So, the whole village inherited a promise." That afternoon, preparations quietly began. Walter noticed bunting appearing between cottages. Tables were carried onto the quay. The smell of baking drifted from almost every house. "What have I missed?" Walter asked Alice. "Haven't they told you?" "Told me what? Tomorrow?" "What about tomorrow?" She looked genuinely surprised. "It's Harbour Day." Walter waited. "The blessing of the fleet." "I've never heard of it." "Most people haven't." She leaned closer. "We've done it every year for over 100 years." Walter watched children decorating little paper boats with coloured ribbons. "It looks important." "It is." Then she smiled. "This year is going to be different." The following morning dawned clear and still. Walter woke before sunrise. The harbour was already alive. Every fishing boat had been decorated with bunting. Flags fluttered gently from masts. Flowers surrounded the harbour cross. Visitors filled the waterfront. Even Malcolm appeared unusually well behaved. Margaret handed Walter a cup of tea. "You'll want to stand near Elias." "Why?" "So you can see." "See what?" She only smiled. Walter was becoming thoroughly accustomed to incomplete answers. The village rector offered a short blessing. Children sang. The local lifeboat crew received warm applause. One by one, the fishing boats sounded their horns before leaving the harbour in a colourful procession. Walter watched them disappear beyond the headland. Then nothing happened. People remained where they were. Nobody left. Everyone looked towards the Evelyn May. Walter glanced at Elias. The old harbour master removed his cap. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It's time." Ben untied the bow rope. Tom released the stern line. Margaret climbed aboard carrying fresh flowers. Alice placed a small photograph inside the cabin. Nobody spoke. Walter felt the silence spreading through the harbour like a tide. A modern fishing boat eased gently alongside, not to tow the Evelyn May away, simply to guide her. As slowly as if afraid of disturbing a sleeping child, the little procession began moving towards the harbour entrance. Walter realized people around him were crying, not loudly, quietly, almost gratefully. The Evelyn May crossed the harbour for the first time in 40 years. Church bells rang. Every boat waiting outside sounded its horn together. The echo rolled back from the cliffs. The sea glittered beneath the morning sun. Walter looked at Elias. "You've all been waiting for this." Elias nodded. 40 years. "Why now?" The old harbour master smiled. "Because promises aren't meant to last forever." Walter frowned. "I don't understand." "We promised she'd never be abandoned." He watched the boat. "Not that she'd never sail." The little convoy travelled only half a mile beyond the harbour mouth. There, engines fell silent. For several moments, every boat simply drifted. The sea was almost perfectly calm. Margaret scattered the flowers across the water. Children waved. Caps were removed. No speeches were made. None were needed. Then the Evelyn May was turned gently towards home. Walter had expected sadness. Instead, he felt something much lighter, completion, as though the harbour itself had quietly exhaled. That evening, Gull's Haven celebrated long after sunset. Music drifted from the pub. Children chased each other along the quay carrying paper lanterns. Someone persuaded Walter to judge a homemade pie competition, despite him insisting he possessed no qualifications whatsoever. He accidentally awarded first prize to the wrong pie. Nobody minded. Margaret laughed until she cried. Ben declared the mistake entirely traditional. Even Malcolm stole only one sausage. Walter sat later on his favourite bench overlooking the harbour. The Evelyn May rested once more in her familiar berth. But somehow she looked different. Not older, lighter, as if something she had been carrying had finally been laid down. Elias joined him. "She'll stay here?" Walter asked. "Oh, yes." "Still looked after?" "Always?" Walter smiled. "I'm glad." "So am I." The old harbour master stood. "You'll be leaving tomorrow?" "I suppose I shall." "You'll come back?" Walter looked across the moonlit harbour. "I think I probably will." Elias nodded. "They usually do." Walter laughed. "I've heard that before." As darkness settled over Gull's Haven, the harbour lights shimmered across the still water. For the first time since his arrival, Walter no longer wondered why the boat had never sailed. He understood. Some journeys were never about reaching another shore. Some were about reminding the people left behind that love, like the tide, never truly disappears. And when Walter Bramble returned home the following morning, he carried no souvenirs except a smooth piece of sea glass, the recipe for Margaret's fish pie, and the comforting certainty that somewhere on the coast there was a little harbour where an old promise had finally come home.